Currently I'm getting no charge out of the alternator, and if I meter the battery banks when the engine's running, I don't see the alternator voltage. I'm just reading like, about 12 volts. My understanding of the factory charge system is that this coily yellow wire that comes off the alternator ties into a bundle of wires that goes behind this engine stringer. From there, I think it travels over to this bulkhead and travels up the right-hand side of the house. From there, it goes to the cabinet and the flybridge and connects to the flybridge amp meter. From the flybridge amp meter, that yellow run continues down to the lower helm amp meter. And from there, it travels back down the side of the house. And the bundle emerges from this floor, from the deck flooring. See the yellow lines here in the bundle. And they eventually emerge after going through the bus bars. I come to this little discovery. I think the previous owner, let me back up. I think these two lines were originally connected to this battery selector switch to a position for charging. Now, I don't have the documentation on the selector switch, and there are no labels. So I could get out my continuity meter and attempt to trace every connection. I'd first have to disconnect and label everything. I don't really want to do that. I may have to. But anyway, I think this was originally connected to a charge section of the selector switch. I think in order to charge the batteries, the selector switch had to be set to charge. But then I don't understand how you would determine which bank is getting the charge. Engine, house, and obviously combining. So maybe this switch is only intended for the AC battery charger. In which case the alternator is always feeding maybe the engine bank. And then I would select both if I wanted to charge the house bank as well as the engine bank when underway. But then if I selected the house bank, does that mean the house isn't charging, but the first bank, the engine bank, gets a charge? I don't know. Now, to add to that, we bought the boat. There was an old 80s era battery charger, which didn't work particularly well. I replaced it, well, let me back up. I originally replaced it with a 25 amp charger, ProTech. I actually got two of these, 2 for 1. They were factory remanufactured, kind of a convoluted mess, but I had two 25 amp chargers. Well, one of them was defective, so they ended up giving me a 30 amp 3-bank charger. So at the moment I have all 3 of my banks, main, engine, house, and genset, wired to this 30 amp charger, and I've never used this guy. I just since I installed it, I've left it there as a spare. Now, this wiring was in place when I installed the charger. There are 3 runs that go directly to each battery bank. So here we have the generator, the house, and this remaining one is the engine start. I traced these. These are my tape labels from 2014. Now, if you can refer back to one of my electrical videos previously. There was a jumper line, this one right here, that when we would get back to the dock, fire up the AC charger, and it was pumping a full 30 amps in, this jumper line would get really hot. So I think I had some redundancy in the charge wiring where it's coming off one of the charge ports on the charger, and then it was hopping over this jumper to get to the other bank. I don't know. So I started tracing and trying to remove things, and I think what happened is in the process of getting the switch to run cool and to successfully AC charge all 3 banks, I think I somehow disconnected the alternator. Reading through the threads on the CHB owners group, there's some discussion about the charge system and rewiring this vintage of boat, which is where I picked up the explanation of the run originating at the alternator, traveling up to the instrument panel on the flybridge, lower HIM panel, and then the selector switch breaker panel. And because of that long run of connections, there's a significant voltage drop. So by the time the alternator current gets to the battery banks, there's some voltage loss, which results in a slower charge. So what many owners have done is they've removed that wiring and done a direct run in the engine room from the alternator to a selector switch or one of the battery banks. So here's my plan, which will most definitely evolve as I go through this. First, I'm going to disconnect the yellow cable from the alternator. Then I will connect a temporary cable from the alternator to this fuse block, which I've installed. I have a video on the install of this fuse block. So this fuse box is pulling power from the house bank right here through this line. This red pass-through continues on to the main breaker panel selector switch. So as a temporary troubleshoot, I'm going to connect from the alternator directly to this terminal, and then I will meter the output. And referring to the Lehman manual in the electrical system section, the alternator does not output current until the oil pressure switch has engaged, which is that unit right there. The oil pressure switch does not engage until obviously the engine has oil pressure. So the idea is that when you're cranking to start the engine, the alternator is not under load. It's not creating extra resistance, and it's not outputting current. And then once you release the starter, oil pressure comes up, the alternator will start outputting current. This is the original engine start bank disconnect switch for the starter. This is in place so you can disable power going to the starter. In the case of an emergency, say the starter stays stuck engaged, eventually the thing's going to catch on fire. So you would throw this switch to disconnect, and then also if you're going to leave the boat when it's unattended, it's a good idea to turn this off. I, for the most part, leave it on. I should get in the habit of turning it off. I don't because, well, it's in the engine room and it's kind of a pain to get to. And it was on this piece of plywood that was screwed into this stud. That has since failed. So what I'm thinking is, next steps is I'm gonna order a Blue Sea remote battery switch and install that battery switch with this existing wiring right here in the engine room to keep my runs short. And then I'll put the remote switch at the panel. All right, so I'm not getting any current out of the alternator. So next I want to test the oil pressure switch that engages the alternator. So I've got my test leads on the pressure switch, and then I've got the meter set to continuity with a beep. I'm going to start the engine and see what happens. Alright, I'm confident I got a bad alternator. Getting 12 volts off the battery bank. Connected to the alternator terminal. I verified the oil pressure switch that engages the alternator is functioning correctly. I tried starting the engine and manually closing the switch to engage the alternator. And when I do that, there is no change in voltage. I tightened the tension of the alternator belt. It was a little loose, but it didn't appear to be slipping. I think the brain side of this alternator needs service. So I'm gonna pull this and find an alternator shop. That is the house bank lead that goes to the breaker panel. I'll figure out what gauge, wire, and post size and order a new one of these.